The state of cybersecurity at the dawn of a new decade. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Paul Kolbe, former CIA officer, recipient of the Intelligence Medal of Merit and the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, and currently the director of the Intelligence Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Welcome, Paul.
How are you?
Good. What's the mission of the Intelligence Project?
So the Intelligence Project, we help prepare a new generation of future intelligence practitioners, as well as policymakers who will be using intelligence. And we hope to explore the nexus between intelligence and policy so that we have a better take-up between those who are producing intelligence and those who are consuming it.
Recently, a sophisticated cyber attack on the US government and other large corporations filled the news cycle. Politicians on both sides of the aisle called this, if you will, an act of war. Briefly describe the nature and scope of SolarWinds attack.
So I'll start with was not an act of war. It was an act of sophisticated, massive espionage. So there's been a lot of hyperbole around what's actually happening. The SolarWinds attack was a supply chain attack, hack that used software used by many government agencies and thousands of private companies to manage their own networks. By inserting the malware, their tools, into those backdoors, into that supply chain, they were able to penetrate, lurk, explore, manipulate IT networks of many different companies and agencies.
The US is one big attack surface, isn't it? I mean, technology and free enterprise are pillars of our society, and our economy is huge. Is there just too much cyber battle space to defend?
No, the US is uniquely vulnerable, um, but it's important, stepping back a little bit, it's important for folks to understand that we live in an age of ambient cyber conflict. There's constantly efforts on a multilateral, global scale taking place all the time. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of hacks, attacks, manipulations taking place every day, hidden behind the scenes. Most of us don't see this. US is a big player in that ambient cyber conflict. It's used for espionage. It's used for preparation of the battlefield, to recon opponent networks, adversary networks. It's used to emplace weapons, which could be used in time of conflict, which could be triggered. And it's used to activate weapons, as we've seen in attacks such as Stuxnet and others. And it's all commingled with massive amounts of cybercrime, which are sometimes used as cover for these operations and sometimes just provide lots of noise. But it's another aspect that folks have to be thinking about.
You mentioned it wasn't an act of war, but the world of nation state cyber operations is an eternal game of cat and mouse. So, at what point does a particular move by a threat actor become an act of war?
Well, let's use sort of traditional terms of espionage and warfare, right? So nations have been spying on each other for as long as there were nations and long before there were nations. So using human or technical assets to steal information, to uncover secret information and to steal that is, traditionally and has not been either in practice or in international law seen as an act of war. Um, Actions which are destructive, which take out, say, for example, critical infrastructure. If you were to use cyber tools to turn the valves on a refinery, which released hydrocarbons and caused, fire, death, mayhem, that would rightly be seen as a hostile act and potentially as an act of war. And the U.S. has specifically said we reserve the right to respond to such attacks, not just in kind, not just with cyber weapons, but with the full range of weapons at our disposal. So if an adversary such as Iran, for example, were to create a cyber attack, which were to cause massive disruption of the financial sector, which were to cause physical destruction of critical infrastructure, the U.S. might respond with a cyber attack, cyber response. It might respond in other ways.
Who are the nation state threat actors that challenge the US most often? Who are the usual suspects?
So I think one of the aspects of cyber that's important to understand is just how accessible it is and how many players there are and how much it's viewed as a great equalizer, as a great asymmetric tool for states that aren't as powerful as the U.S., that don't spend as much as the U.S. to offset U.S. power. Major players, the sort of the usual suspects: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are most commonly pointed to as the most active and effective cyber actors. But just about anybody who's got a computer and an internet link can play in the game. Cyber tools, unlike nuclear weapons, cyber weapons proliferate quickly, instantaneously. They proliferate without regard to border. They don't require massive Manhattan Project level programs to build. So while it's an area where the U.S. has had strategic advantage for many years, it's an advantage that's eroding. And it's offset by where you started with our unique vulnerability, the size of our attack surface, our dependence on the networks that power our financial system, that power Wall Street, that power our telecommunication systems, that sustain our defense networks, and that we're all dependent upon in our daily lives.
Every network admin will tell you that striking the right balance between security, performance, and convenience requires trade-offs. So,
Mhm.
where do we draw the line between examining every data packet and implementing quantum grade encryption?
Right. It's a classic conundrum and often used in the intelligence business. It's the security versus efficiency, relationship, right? Efficiency is not spent, is driving down cost, making things fast, making things cheap, making things accessible and transparent. Security is, adding cost, adding friction in the system, limiting accessibility, limiting access. And those things, stand in juxtaposition. So where's that balance? Well, you've got sort of the strategic level balance. How does the U.S. think about this as a national issue? Where do we guard our networks? And every organization is thinking about it the same way in terms of their own prioritization of time, money, people. I think one of the U.S.'s problems is that we tend to, on both a macro and micro level, prioritize efficiency far more than we do security, particularly when you start getting into smaller companies, mid-cap companies that don't necessarily have the sophistication and resources that a Fortune 10, 50, or 100 company do to devote to this. You see the same thing in U.S. government, security agencies, intelligence services, defense, spend and place a lot more focus and emphasis on security, classified networks, particularly those that have classified networks. Other agencies, you can think of an OPM example, Office of Personnel Management, perhaps put a lot less in and by consequence are more vulnerable. But where
So,
that balance is, it's a difficult question.
so then what threats pose the greatest challenge then, maybe in this coming year?
That's pose the greatest challenge in the coming year. Look, I think we're going to continue to see massive espionage efforts against the U.S. We're going to see continued efforts to reconnoiter, find, and in place tools in our networks that could be used in time of conflict. We have to think about the vulnerability of our financial structures, financial system. I think that's one of the most attractive, juiciest, and perhaps most vulnerable targets that we might face. So I think we have to think about both contingencies in event of conflict. How vulnerable are we in event of a real shooting war? We know that China places huge emphasis on disruption of IT systems, disruption of communication systems as helping to offset our other advantages. But we also, I think, more importantly, have to think about how we build a system that is more resilient, more resistant to the types of hacks that we saw with SolarWinds. And in my mind, that requires much closer cooperation, both between entities in the private sector, but also between private sector and U.S. government.
So, if the US economy were to suffer a massive cyber attack, what would be the first signals we would see?
Oh, could be any number of things. I mean, we've seen DDoS attacks on Wall Street. We've seen banks in New York and elsewhere disrupted over a sustained period of time. It might be something like that. It might be something that slowly sort of evolved and that we understand the scope. So SolarWind started as relatively small story. Didn't look like a very big deal until it started unpeeling the layers of that and the depth and breadth of the activity became apparent. And it could be, suddenly you go into your app looking to find your bank information and you can't find it, or you're not able to access your information, or your information is gone or different. I mean, thousands of different ways that might manifest, and who knows what the first indications of that would be.
Paul Kolbe, director of the Intelligence Project at Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. If somebody wants to connect with you, Paul, maybe they want to find more about the Intelligence Project, how can they do that?
You can go to the Belfer Center website and find the Intelligence Project, and you find our contact information there.
Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Tanya.
And find more of my interviews right here on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify, or at tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.